Hello, I'm Steve Walton. I'm Senior Research Fellow in New Testament at Trinity College in Bristol in the UK.
Dr. Steve Walton. Steve, welcome back to Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you.
You were with us before to talk about Theophilus at the beginning of really both the Gospel of Luke and then the beginning of Acts as well. So I'm going to refer folks back to that and they can get to know you a little bit better. But today we're going to talk about Saul, the Pharisee. And, you know, I remember hearing, Steve, growing up, an evangelist or a preacher somewhere say, and he took great delight in saying this, as I remember, that Saul, the Pharisee, the persecutor of the church, when he came to faith in Jesus, changed his name to Paul. Now, I'm not sure exactly where he got that, but maybe the place that we're going to talk about today in Acts 13:3 is one of those. But kind of give us a sense of, is that the right way to think about it or the wrong way to think about it? What happens there?
Well, he was known as Saul, and he's known as Saul pretty consistently from Acts 8, where he comes into the story at the death of Stephen, through to Acts 13, when he and Barnabas are in Cyprus. But then we get this hinge verse, Acts 13:9, Saul also known as Paul. And from there on, he's pretty consistently known as Paul. Indeed, if you look at Paul's letters, you wouldn't know he was ever known as Saul.
That's right. Yeah, all of his letters are Paul, the apostle, to the churches,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So the question is, where does this name come from? In the Roman world, people had three names. They had a praenomen, which was taken from a very limited list. There are only 18 of these. So for men, it was often shortened to one letter, M for Marcus and G for Gaius. Then you had the nomen, which is your family name, like my surname, Walton. And then you'd have the cognomen, which came last. And that was the name by which people were known. So in my case, Stephen. Now, the thing that was interesting was that other ethnic groups like Jews, who were Roman citizens, as Saul of Tarsus was, often had a fourth name as well from their ethnic family.
Okay.
And that was known as the signum or the supernomen. Now, it seems probable that Saul's mum called him Saul.
That's a Jewish name after all, right? It's a Jewish name.
Yeah, it's Shaul. It's the name of the first king of Israel.
Right.
So he was known as that in Jewish circles. What's interesting is the shift in Acts 13 happens at the point where he's talking to a Roman governor. Saul, also known as Paul, and there's a shift in the name at that point. Now, the Greek form of his name, Saulos,
right,
actually means effeminate or conceited in Greek.
Oh, really? Okay.
So if you're among Greek speakers, you might not wish to be known as that.
Okay, as effeminate, yes.
Whereas...
Or conceited, word, either one, yeah.
Whereas the Latin word Paulus becomes Paulos in Greek. But actually, interestingly, there aren't terribly many examples of this in our ancient literary and inscriptional sources. We've got very few people with the name Paulos in Greek. I think Richard Borkham, the scholar, can only cite two examples.
Really? Okay.
Now, Paul means small, a bit like calling somebody shorty these days.
Yes, yeah.
So maybe he was small when he was born, and that's why he got that as his cognomen, his personal name in Latin. But then his family called him Saul in a Jewish context. So that's where the shift happens. The only other place after that we get him called Saul is in when he reports his conversion story from the Damascus Road, because the voice of Jesus addresses him as Saul, 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 Saul. And in Acts 26:14, we're told that's in the Hebrew language.
Ah, okay.
So Jesus talks his mother tongue to him and calls him Saul. So it's not that he acquired a new name, I think, when he becomes a believer. But what happens is that the change results from a shift into more of a Greek-speaking environment. Up to that point in Cyprus, he and Barnabas have been going through the synagogues where I guess they probably still spoke Greek, because these are diaspora synagogues. And the scriptures would have been read in Greek, and things would have been said in Greek, I think, mostly. But it looks as though, I think this goes back to William Ramsay in the late 19th century, that Paul started to call himself that because he's encountering a Roman governor, and because he's now taking the gospel into the Greek-speaking world and wants to engage with them. And it's noticeable that the audience in the places where he's called Paul is pretty consistently a Greek-speaking audience. The audience where he's known as Saul is an Aramaic or Hebrew-speaking audience. Saul himself on the Damascus Road. But when it's in Acts 22, he's speaking to this mob in Jerusalem in the temple.
Right.
Where, above all, you wouldn't speak Greek. You'd use the local language. So he addresses them in the Hebrew language, Acts 22 says. So when he's describing himself, he describes himself as Saul, and he describes the heavenly voices addressing him as Saul. So it looks as though audience is the major issue.
So to whom is he speaking at that point?
Who he's speaking to, rather than him changing his name. He's not acquiring a new name. Some Christian traditions do that, don't they? When you're baptized or when you're confirmed, you take a new name. But I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's a name he already had. Now, the frustrating thing, of course, is that we don't know what his family name was, and we wish we did.
Yeah, exactly.
And we don't know how he says that he inherited citizenship from his father. And again, we've no idea how his father, presumably a Jew in Tarsus, inherited citizenship, unless it was because he'd done some service for the Roman governor or the Roman soldiers who were stationed there, and as a reward had been made a citizen. But it looks as though what's behind the shift, I think, is a concern for evangelism. He says in 1 Corinthians 9:22 that his policy is to be all things to all people, so that by all means he might save some. So that looks as though a pretty good reason for the shift, because what drives Paul as a Christian is the gospel first and foremost. That's what he's passionate about. That's what he lives his life for. That's what he goes through all those sufferings that he describes for.
Well, I remember reading that there's a sense that he is converted, right, or called. Some would say, is he called? Is he converted? In Acts chapter 9, he's baptized, but he still is called Saul. And this seems, at least in the text, and that goes on for years. He goes to Arabia, he goes to Antioch, he's ministering in a variety of places. And even in Antioch, he's known as Shaul for a while, at least initially. And the Holy Spirit says, set apart for me, Barnabas and Saul to this mission. And so apparently there's a pretty good Hebrew-speaking, Aramaic maybe speaking community there in Antioch as well, because he continues to go by that name at that point. So the audience at that point, and this is for years, so it's not like he's converted and he's like Jacob who wrestles with God, and then after that he's known as Israel, right? There's kind of a tradition of that, But this seems to be something wholly other than what
Yes.
that kind of thing happens, right?
Yeah.
Abram becomes Abraham and such.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that points you to something about his identity, because it's not that he becomes something different after he meets Jesus and is baptized. It's that he's still Jewish, deeply, deeply Jewish, but he's now convinced that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah.
Right.
And he's now come to follow and to worship Jesus. So it's not that his identity has changed from being Jewish to not being Jewish. We tend to make the mistake of thinking Christian and Jewish are two separate things, which in the first century they weren't.
They are today. I mean, right, to
Yes.
be a Jew and you can't be a Christian at the same time. But at that point, that had not been, the parting of the ways had not happened at that point.
No.
We've got to leave it there. Dr. Steve Walton, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
You're welcome.
Hey, I want to thank Steve Walton for being with us today. There's a link to an article that he wrote about this topic, gives you more detail. We're going to put that in the show notes. That'll help you. We hope you have a better sense of why sometimes he's called Saul and other times he's called Paul. Thanks to Ian Rosine, Rebecca Larson, and John Lansma, who is our Wheaton-based director. If you want to study Greek or Hebrew, I have 2 words for you: Wheaton College. Look in the show notes for how to be in touch with them about starting Greek or Hebrew at a graduate level or an undergraduate level. Both programs are there. Great program, one of the best in the country. Get started today. Don't put it off. Now is the time to do it. Hey, listen, it's a delight to be with you for this podcast. My name is David Capes. This is Exegetically Speaking, and we want to say thanks for listening.